shall take the harvest home. From the field shall in that day all offenses purge away. Giving angels charge at last in the fire the tears to cast. But the fruitful is destroyed in the garner evermore. Even so, Lord, quickly come, bring that final harvest home. Gather thou thy people in, free from sorrow, free from sin. They're forever purified, in thy presence to abide. Come with all thine angels, come, raise the glorious harvest home.
Shalom, saints, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I'm your host, CJ Cox. Wanted to give a brief shout-out to those of you who are in the live chat. I see Ryan, Doki Doki, and Kelby Clio have so far made themselves known in the live chat. Shalom to you all, and thank you for being here. If you are here, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so, and hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Sorry about that. I want to go ahead and go through some channel announcements real quick. First off, I can see there's a little "this is odd" kind of face in the live chat. Yes, I'm not super big on contemporary worship music, to be honest, but it was hard to find a version of that song that wasn't copyrighted, which if I understand correctly, the one that I just played was not copyrighted. So unfortunately, a lot of choirs do actually copyright some of their work. I also, to be fair, didn't look as in depth as the study I did here. It was kind of like a last second thing, like, oh yeah, I start these off with a hymn, and then, kind of scrambling for an hour or so to find that. So if I had put a little bit more time into it, maybe I could find an actually good choir version. But nevertheless, that's Come All You Thankful People. And it is, in its original version, I think is much better. But nevertheless, I do appreciate the people who put it together. I mean, obviously they're working hard, giving their musical talents to the Lord. So I don't want to insult them or anything, but I do tend to want more traditional style music. At any rate, let's go ahead and jump right into our channel housekeeping. Of course, want to say, if you're here, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Questions, comments, criticisms, or concerns in the live chat. If you're here with us live, if you're watching this after the fact, then remember you can also leave any comments or questions or anything like that in the comment section down below. If you want to follow us on any of the various social media platforms which you frequent, I am on Gab, Parler, Facebook, Twitter, and Minds at the tag The Synagogue. Different display name on each, but nevertheless, if you look up The Synagogue, you should be able to find me. If you're on any of those websites, please remember to follow us there. And if you are there and you are following us, definitely give a share of this video and maybe even a tag. Shout out to your boy. I would certainly appreciate that. And thank you in advance, anybody who's doing that. Let's see what else we got. This is our 14th, if you count the calendar episode of the SAMEACH series. For those who do not know, SAMEACH is a series I do here going through the universal Christian feasts, the so-called Jewish feasts, which includes the 5 biblical feasts, as well as Purim and Hanukkah. And also, as you can see, Thanksgiving is one of the ones we're going to be looking at. Specifically the one we're going to be looking at today. If you guys are interested and have not seen already, I have previous episodes on Epiphany, Candlemas, Purim, Passover, Easter, Ascension, Shavuot, Pentecost, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Halloween This one is, of course, on Thanksgiving, and the next two coming up are going to be on Hanukkah and on Christmas. So by that time, we'll be done with the whole thing. By the way, we do also have a bonus episode, which is Much Ado About Calendars, episode 187. That is obviously going through the different calendars and stuff like that, which are important to this whole study, right? We are looking at holidays, which, were celebrated either on Hebrew or Gregorian calendars. That's the first thing. Then also Orthodox Church celebrates the Christian holidays on a different date than the rest of us because they use the Julian calendar. And, the way that these things have calculated is intricately linked with those calendars and stuff like that. So nevertheless, if you want that bonus episode, that is also in the series as well. There's a whole playlist on the channel, and I am going to go back and add descriptions to all these videos so that you guys can just find it underneath, but it's not now. We do open mics every Friday night. Didn't do it this last Friday and may not actually do it this Friday either, simply because I am trying to get quite a few things done at the moment, not least of which is these SAMEACH, but also, and this will be an announcement that I'm going to talk about here in just a moment, a book that I am going to be publishing here very soon. So we may have our usual Sabbath night open mic this week. We may not. We'll see what ends up going on there. But nevertheless, if you guys are frequent watchers of this channel, or if you're new here, I guess it just applies to anybody, know that we do typically have weekly open mics every Friday night, our Sabbath night open mics. Topics vary from week to week. And be on the lookout for those if you're new here. And if you're expecting one this Friday, know that it may not actually happen because of scheduling conflicts. Last thing, I am writing a book. I'm actually getting finished with the book at this point, called 18 Questions for the Reformed Answered. It is just like it sounds. 18 questions that are commonly asked of those of us who adhere to Reformed theology, that is Calvinism. And it's me going through in depth as much as I can, answering these questions, hopefully to everybody's satisfaction. If you are interested in that, either because you'd like to argue with me or because you would like to, study more in-depth Calvinism, or maybe you want to provide some answers to these questions to your friends, either way, be on the lookout for that book. I am expecting to have it out either by late April or early May. So very soon, right around the corner. Anybody who's interested in that, be sure to keep your ears and eyes perked up, and certainly appreciate anybody who's interested in that in advance. All right, as I said, this is our 13th episode in the SAMEACH series. Today, we're going to be talking about Thanksgiving. And so the question for us to be asking today is, quite simply, what is Thanksgiving? So let me go ahead and pull up my tabs here, and we will get right into this conversation. What is Thanksgiving? America's Harvest Festival. You can see I have underneath here my little subtitle, America's Harvest Festival. That is technically what Thanksgiving is. It is not the only thing that Thanksgiving is, but of course it is a very big component as far as what Thanksgiving is. And so, let's go ahead and dive right into this. What is this? So, obviously, we start off with our fast facts. When is Thanksgiving? It is the fourth Thursday of every November, annually, of course. Other nations also celebrate their own Thanksgivings. These are countries such as Canada, St. Lucia, Grenada, Liberia, and etc. There are other ones. Each of these celebrates Thanksgiving on their own date. So Canada, for example, celebrates Thanksgiving on the second Monday of October. Of course, there is reason for that. It's because the tradition and history behind how that holiday got set up, while linked to our Thanksgiving, is not identical to our Thanksgiving. So, obviously, as a result, a lot of these are going to take place on different dates. Some of it is to be more closely aligned with the harvest. Some of it is, more traditional and contextual with their own history. But regardless, Thanksgiving in America is on the fourth Thursday of November. In other nations that celebrate their own Thanksgivings, it will have separate dates that are not necessarily in line with our own, although they certainly could be. The so-called first Thanksgiving, you'll figure out why I say so-called in a moment, was actually in October, October, at least more than likely. It may have been very late September, sometime around Michaelmas, which is September 29th. And it's one of the, kind of saint holidays that the Catholics celebrate for St. Michael, who is in fact the archangel. But nevertheless, not in November as we typically celebrate today, although it certainly is possible it could have been. There are some historians who would say it could have been potentially early November, no later than November 11th. But most historians will say either very late September, or most historians will say sometime in early to mid-October. But nevertheless, before Thanksgiving became an official holiday, it was not celebrated annually. Rather, leaders would declare a day of Thanksgiving whenever they felt something of positive significance had occurred. And these, as you might expect, could vary wildly in date. There's December 1st Thanksgivings, there's December 4th Thanksgivings, there's October Thanksgivings, November Thanksgivings, July Thanksgivings, right? These would actually vary all over the calendar because they weren't actually a set holiday. They were, something awesome that is seemingly an example of God's providence and mercy has occurred. And so the world leader, or the nation leaders, would then declare a day of Thanksgiving for such and such a date, right? And obviously, like I said, that could just vary from day to day to day. When Thanksgiving did become an annual holiday, which was 1863, it was actually celebrated on the last Thursday of November, which of course could be the 4th, but also might be the 5th Thursday of November. And it was only actually moved to be the 4th Thursday of November in 1939. And we'll get a little bit more in depth as far as why that change occurred. Actually, I'll explain it here a little bit. We're going to have more explanation here, but I just remembered I do have another bullet point here that actually explains it. President Franklin D. Roosevelt changed the holiday to the 4th Thursday of November in 1939. This was done to allow merchants more time to sell products before Christmas, as the Great Depression was still raging. Fun fact, the parent company of Macy's, Federated Department Stores, their leader, Fred Lazarus Jr., their founder, Fred Lazarus Jr., was actually kind of responsible for that change. He'd suggested the idea to FDR, but nevertheless. So those are some fast facts about the date. What about the why? Why is this holiday? Why do we celebrate it? It is, of course, a day of giving thanks to the Lord, and it also doubles as the American Harvest Festival. Harvest festivals and days of Thanksgiving are not necessarily the same. In most other countries, they will be different. But in America, our Harvest Festival and our National Day of Thanksgiving are one and the same day, even though the American harvest for most products does take place well before the November date that we typically celebrate this holiday. Most harvests are going to take place sometime between July and at latest early October. But nevertheless, this is what we have as our harvest festival, and there's a lot of contextual historical reasons for that. What's with the name? Thanksgiving is an English word meaning the giving of thanks, of course. The name derives from old Protestant days of Thanksgiving, which were declared anytime the people felt they were being blessed by God. For example, good harvest, military victory, discovering new land, the delivery of much needed supplies, and so on. Basically, something awesome has happened that seems to be an example of God's divine mercy. And so, like I said, leaders would declare a day of Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is sometimes jokingly referred to as Turkey Day, as it is traditional to eat a turkey dinner on Thanksgiving Day. And so there's the fast facts for you. Let's move right into the reason for the season. Thanksgiving is, as the name suggests, a national day of giving thanks to the Lord. It is deeply rooted in the Protestant tradition. And in fact, you could say it's the first Protestant holiday in a way, although you could also argue the Reformation Day is the first Protestant holiday. But early pilgrims would establish days of Thanksgiving, and the English church itself would establish days of Thanksgiving after, like I said, all sorts of different good events that had taken place. Early pilgrims had established days of Thanksgiving in the New World immediately after landing here, as well as after bountiful harvests and after surviving particularly vicious winter seasons and natural disasters, amongst other things. One early record of one of the earliest Thanksgivings, it's a kind of redundant statement, right? One of the early records of one of the first Thanksgivings reads thusly, quote, "We ordain that this day of our ship's arrival at the place assigned for plantation is the land of Virginia, and shall be yearly and perpetually kept as a day of thanksgiving to Almighty God," end quote. This is from Berkeley Hundred's London Company Charter, 1619 AD. And if you are historically astute, you may notice that Virginia is not Massachusetts, where they say the first Thanksgiving took place. And also the 1619 is before 1621, when they say the first Thanksgiving took place. Fun fact, the first Thanksgiving wasn't really the first Thanksgiving, kind of. It's a little complicated, but we'll, of course, get into that on the slide where we're discussing that. Nevertheless, this is from December 4th, 1619, or this Thanksgiving was celebrated December 4th, 1619. This is actually written a little bit earlier than that. And it is a record of one of our earliest Thanksgiving holidays on the North American continent. Thanksgiving is also America's harvest festival, though, as I said, most North American harvests will actually take place in most areas of the country because, of course, it can vary from area to area. If you're in the South, it's not going to be the same as if you're in Idaho. But will actually be much earlier than this November date, usually between mid-July and early October. A harvest festival is, as you might guess, a festival celebrating a given culture's harvest season. Popular harvest festivals outside of our own Thanksgiving include Shavuot and Sukkot on the Jewish calendar, Samhain, which is actually, it looks like Samhain, but it is actually pronounced Samhain, which also is the beginning of the Celtic winter, and of course the world's various Thanksgivings, amongst other different harvest festivals. The origin story, or how the holiday started to be celebrated, is thus. As previously stated, the first Thanksgivings were deeply rooted in Protestant tradition, specifically English Protestant days of humiliation and Thanksgiving, which we'll give more info on slide 6. The first day of Thanksgiving declared in America, the first days, plural, of Thanksgiving declared in America date back to the first permanent English settlements in the New World, for example, Jamestown and Plymouth. But Jamestown being the first that actually had recorded Thanksgiving, at least amongst English settlers. Jamestown was, of course, founded in 1607. The first major festival would take place in 1610. This is a record from Who Celebrated the First Thanksgiving, an article in the Library of Congress's Wise Guide from 2002. Quote, "The harsh winter of 1609 to 1610 generated a famine that caused the deaths of 430 of the 490 settlers in Jamestown," which, I mean, that is just an absolutely massive death toll, right? I'm not super great at math, but 430 out of 490, I'd imagine that's somewhere around 60, 70, 80% of the population, if not more. I mean, it's just an extreme amount of death in this winter. And you can see why getting out of this traumatic winter would be an incredibly beneficial thing. Or not just a beneficial thing, but just something you want to celebrate, right? By the way, I did just do the math real quickly on my calendar. It's 87.7% of the population that died out. 87.7%. That's extreme. Anyways, back to the quote. "In the spring of 1610, colonists in Jamestown, Virginia, enjoyed a Thanksgiving service after English supply ships arrived with food. The colonial celebration has also been considered the first Thanksgiving, although it is not the famous first Thanksgiving that we're usually taught about in schools. Nevertheless, it is the first Thanksgiving recorded by English settlers on the North American continent." So kind of the first Thanksgiving, but not the one we think of as the first Thanksgiving. Like I said, we'll get into all of that here in a moment. Another early Thanksgiving, which we've already referenced, took place on December 4th, 1619, again in Jamestown. That's the one with the quote I read here earlier from their London Charter. The more famous first Thanksgiving, which we'll discuss in depth on slide 7, took place sometime in October 1621 at Plymouth, up north in Massachusetts. Obviously, there being multiple Thanksgivings before this, it is somewhat odd that this was considered the first Thanksgiving, but again, we will explain in depth how all of this ended up coming about. Thanksgiving celebrations remained sporadic for over 2 centuries after these moments. Famous Thanksgiving proclamations would take place in 1623, 1777, and 1789, although there were certainly many besides these during the centuries the century and a half, I guess, between 1623 and 1789. The first Thanksgiving proclamation in United States history, United States, of course, being a country, would be given by Congress on November 1st, 1777. It was written by Samuel Adams, the first national proclamation of Thanksgiving, and again, it dates to 1777, reading thusly, quote, "It is therefore recommended to the legislative or executive powers of these United States to set apart Thursday, the 18th day of December next, for solemn thanksgiving and praise. This at one time that at one time and with one voice, the good people may express the grateful feelings of their hearts and consecrate themselves to the service of their divine benefactor, and that together with their sincere acknowledgments and offerings, they may join the penitent Congress for their manifold sins, join the penitent confession, of their manifold sins, whereby they had forfeited every favor," end quote. And again, that's Samuel Adams, first national proclamation of Thanksgiving, 1777. You'll notice that this one was set to take place in December, specifically December 18th, not November, as we are typically accustomed. Again, these days of Thanksgiving, because they were not an annual holiday, could vary wildly as far as when exactly they were taking place. We just saw the one in 1610 was in July. The original Thanksgiving was in October, the one that's traditionally attributed as being the first Thanksgiving. Then, of course, these two in December 18th and December 4th, so on and so forth. George Washington, within the first year of his presidency, proclaimed another famous Thanksgiving on October 3rd, 1789, the first Thanksgiving to be declared by an official U.S. government. Of course, in 1777, the Revolution was still going on. So this is an actual, an official United States government sans rather, the Revolution. I can't even talk right now. I'm sorry, guys. Here's the quote here. George Washington's Thanksgiving Proclamation of 1789, quote, "Now, therefore, I do recommend and assign Thursday, the 26th day of December next, to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being who is the beneficent author of all good that was, that is, or that will be," end quote. By the way, just kind of a fun fact, a lot of people like to say that George Washington was not religious, but of course, here he is talking about that great, glorious being who is the author of all good that was, that is, or will ever be. Doesn't really sound deistic if deism is understood to mean a God that doesn't really operate or doesn't really participate in human affairs, but nevertheless. This holiday would not become an annual celebration until 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln proclaimed a day of Thanksgiving on October 3rd to be celebrated on November the 26th. Brief note here, technically the Holidays Act of 1870, which was signed into law by President Ulysses S. Grant, is what officially made Thanksgiving an annual holiday, but Thanksgiving had been celebrated every year from 1863 to 1870, so he was just making official what everybody was already doing anyways. Here is a quote from Abraham Lincoln in his proclamation of Thanksgiving, 1863, quote, "It has seemed to me fit and proper that they should be solemnly, reverently, and gratefully acknowledged as with one heart and voice by the whole American people. I do therefore invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States, and also those who are at sea and those who are sojourning in foreign lands, to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November next as a day of thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father who dwelleth in the heavens." End quote. Another fun fact, a lot of people like to claim that Abraham Lincoln was not only not a Christian, but an atheist. And this is hot garbage. I don't mean, we're not going to get into that necessarily right now, but it is hot, stinking garbage. He did seem to have some atheistic leanings when he was very young, like in his 20s. But by the time he was president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln was an incredibly devout man. And in fact, he references God in his speeches probably more than any other president in American history. I'd be interested to see if anybody has done research on that, because Ronald Reagan, George Bush, William McKinley would certainly be up there as well. But Abraham Lincoln is constantly making reference to God. He quotes the Bible. I do know this one for a fact. He quotes the Bible more than any president in American history. He was a devout churchgoer. Obviously, we don't know his heart, but the notion that Abraham Lincoln was a confessional atheist is just hot garbage. But at any rate, back to my slide here. The day would be celebrated from 1863 to 1938 on the last Thursday of November, which could be the 4th and also could be the 5th. Starting in 1939, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt moved the date to help merchants sell more product during the Great Depression, Thanksgiving was and has been celebrated on the 4th Thursday of November, which, as I said, may or may not be the last. If you want some interesting reading, look into the Franksgiving controversy, which actually happened as a result of this change. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was very much opposed by a lot of Republicans when he changed the date from the last Thursday to the 4th Thursday. Now, again, his reason for doing this was to provide merchants more time to sell Christmas product in between Thanksgiving and Christmas, right? It kind of gives them an extra week. In this particular instance, because the 5th Thanksgiving was going to be, or the 5th Thursday rather, was going to, I'm wording this wrong. There would be a 5th Thursday that year. And so if he moved it to the 4th Thursday rather than the last Thursday in November, that would provide the merchants an extra week to sell their product in a time when they desperately needed some help because the Great Depression was raging and not a lot of people are going out splooging a bunch of money on Christmas product, right? So certainly it made a lot of sense for him to do this. But a lot of Republicans thought that FDR was actually trying to essentially defecate on the memory of Abraham Lincoln. And so while the majority of the country celebrated Thanksgiving on the 4th Thursday of November 1939, a lot of diehard Republicans celebrated Thanksgiving on the 5th Thursday of November 1939. And this is what is commonly known as the Franksgiving controversy. It's a very weird, bizarre political game that was played in 1939. But yeah, that happened. Look it up if you want some interesting reading. I am only very briefly glossing over it at the moment. Super weird. But nevertheless, moving on. Days of humiliation and Thanksgiving. As previously stated, Thanksgiving derives from the Old English Protestant tradition of declaring days of humiliation after tragic events perceived to be God's judgment, and days of Thanksgiving after favorable events perceived to be God's mercy. This custom dates back to at least 1009 AD and the reign of Alfred the Unready. What an unfortunate name, right? But it took on newfound importance after the English Reformation, especially amongst the Puritans. This is a quote from Bruce David Forbes on his America's Favorite Holidays Candid Histories book. This is page 155, and this book was published in 2015. Quote, prior to Henry VIII, England observed 147 religious holidays throughout the year, including Sundays. Real quickly leaving the quote, I would just like to point out how utterly absurd that is. 147 holidays. And by the way, if you're Catholic or Orthodox, this is still a thing, right? Because not only do you celebrate the 7 universal Christian feasts that we've been going over here on this series, right? Your Epiphany, your Candlemas, your Ascension, Christmas, Halloween, Easter, Pentecost. You could add some of the other days there like Good Friday and Ash Wednesday and stuff like that are considered part of Easter tide. But then also you have all the days of Mariology. You have the Day of the Annunciation, which is March 25th. You have all the different saints' days like St. Patrick's Day, St. Nicholas's Day, St. Michael's Day, St. Valentine's Day, so on and so forth. And it just gets utterly absurd at some point, right? Even if you remove, let's say there's 52 Sundays in a year, which that's a general number because sometimes there's going to be more or less, but nevertheless, let's just say that, no, not 52 Sundays in a year, sorry. It'd be 52 months, so I'd have to do that by 4, so it'd be 208 Sundays in a year. So you have your 208 Sundays in a year plus 147 holidays, right? Like, that is absolutely bonkers, and it actually started to mess with the economy, as this article is about to, or as this quote rather is about to briefly explain. That's just mind-numbing in my opinion. But anyways, back to the quote. And I'll reread it here. Prior to Henry VIII, England observed 147 religious holidays throughout the year, including Sundays. By the way, the quote says including Sundays, but he doesn't actually mean including Sundays. He means on top of Sundays. If you read the whole book, it'll actually explain that, but nevertheless. That might sound good because they were days off of work, but they were also days without pay, and church attendance was mandatory. The huge number of special days interfered with the general economy and completion of vital tasks such as harvest. So much idle time. I think I did my math wrong earlier when I did the. Anyways, not the point. I think I was right originally when I said 52, and I'm just starting to remember now that because it'd be 52 weeks, right? So one Sunday every week. Anyways, my own being stupid aside, I was right earlier when I said 52 Sundays. Not the point. That might sound good because they were days off of work, but they were also days without pay and church attendance was mandatory. The huge number of special days interfered with the general economy and completion of vital tasks such as harvest. So much idle time also provided occasion for troublesome public behavior. For both practical and religious reasons, Henry VIII reduced the number of festival days other than Sundays to 27. But for some Puritans, that still left too many. And by the way, that still is far more than what we would currently have now. In fact, celebrating both the Jewish holidays and the universal Christian holidays, that's 15 right there, plus Memorial Day and the 4th of July, and, some of the more, I guess, just generally fun ones like New Year's Day and Valentine's Day, that's still only 19. At Veterans Day, that's 20. I don't really care much about St. Patrick's Day and, President's Day, Labor Day, stuff like that. Like it's a day off of work, but it's not something I really care about. But we're still only, even including those, we're still only at 23, right? And I'm adding those additional holidays that most of us don't celebrate. For most of you guys, you probably celebrate something like 8 to 15 holidays a year, right? And even when Henry reduced from this 147, he's still at 27 plus, of course, Sundays. Nevertheless, back to the quote. For some Puritans, that still left too many. They argued that Sundays were enough, that vital Christian themes were lifted up on Sundays, and that all other holidays were unjustified Catholic traditions. They were wrong about this, but nevertheless, this is how they felt. However, Puritans did participate in occasional days of fasting and days of Thanksgiving, sometimes declared by the Church of England, but developed even further by the Puritans. A day of Thanksgiving might be declared to celebrate and thank God for a particular military victory or good health following a wave of disease, or an especially bountiful harvest that saved people from starvation. The annual days of Thanksgiving consisted mainly of worship services and family dinners, and this was repeated over the years. End quote. This is, again, Bruce David Forms from his book, America's Favorite Holidays, Candid Histories, and that is page 155, published in 2015. Fun fact, America's National Day of Prayer also derives from the tradition of days of humiliation and Thanksgiving, specifically the days of humiliation. In 17th century New England, days of Thanksgiving tended to be called in the fall, and days of humiliation tended to be called in the spring. These fall Thanksgivings would eventually evolve into our modern Thanksgiving, and the days of fasting in the spring would eventually evolve into our National Day of Prayer, though that was not officially declared a thing until Harry S. Truman declared it in 1952. So a little fun fact about that. You got a little tidbit about America's National Day of Prayer as well. And I hope I'm explaining all this clearly. I feel like I'm kind of stuttering a little bit today, but nevertheless, hope everything's going smoothly for you guys. Anyways, the first Thanksgiving, quote unquote. Technically, as you've already seen, the famous first Thanksgiving is not actually the first Thanksgiving. Days of Thanksgiving were called in America a few times before this famous first, most notably in spring of 1610 and winter of 1619, amongst other dates. Also, technically, the first Thanksgiving wasn't actually a day of Thanksgiving, but it was a harvest festival. Nevertheless, the famous Plymouth Harvest Festival of September to October of 1621 is the festival which we've traditionally recorded as being the first Thanksgiving. But yes, you heard that correctly. Fun fact, it was neither the first Thanksgiving, nor was it actually a day of Thanksgiving. Kind of weird how that ends up working out, right? But let's continue. The story goes like this. And by the way, contrary to what modern liberal scholars would like to tell you, all accounts from the actual people there, all primary sources suggest that this story is true. After the Mayflower landed at Cape Cod on November 11th, 1620 AD, things for the Pilgrims went absolutely terribly pretty much immediately. The winter of 1620 to 1621 AD was unusually harsh, and the Pilgrims were not used to farming in the New England climate, being, of course, British people who had come from England. Of the 102 passengers who were aboard the Mayflower, only 53 would live through that winter, just barely under 50% dying off. At the same time, the local Native American tribes were also struggling, dying off as new Old World diseases, which they had no immunity to, had ravaged their populations for the first time. One tribe in particular, the Patuxet, lost every single member of their tribe with the sole exception of one, and that is Tisquantum, whom history remembers by the diminutive Squanto, and who had been kidnapped roughly 15 years earlier and taken to Europe, thus avoiding the plague on his people entirely. Samoset, who was an Abenaki Sachem, or paramount chief, and was the first Native American to make contact with the Pilgrims at Plymouth, requested that Squanto come into the colony and help them survive the new environment. Squanto would teach them how to fish for eel, grow New World crops like maize, squash, and beans, and fertilize the exhausted soil by burying fish with the seeds. He would also translate for them and be heavily involved in their diplomatic relations with other tribes, of course being able to speak both English and Algonquin. Speaking of another Native American, Massasoit, Sachem of the Wampanoag Confederation, sought an alliance with the Pilgrims against his rival tribe, known as the Narragansett. The same plague that killed the Patuxet had also ravaged the Wampanoag, but it had largely spared their rival Narragansett. So, fearing the Narragansett, Massasoit gave supplies to the Plymouth colonists in the hope that this would foster this prospective alliance, and with these supplies and Squanto's instructions, the Plymouth colony would survive and even begin to prosper, and would celebrate their first harvest in fall of 1621. The festival is believed to have taken place in early October, though anywhere from late September to early November has been suggested. At first, the celebration only involved the Plymouth colonists, the 53 who had survived the grueling winter of 1620 to 1621 AD. As the colonists grew loud and started firing their rifles into the air in a celebratory fashion, a group of concerned natives fearing violence and war journeyed into the camp to see what all the commotion was about. When they arrived, the Plymouth colonies embraced them tender-heartedly, and roughly 90 Wampanoag and, of course, Patuxet Squanto joined the feasting and festivities and brought their own cuisine and dishes with them. The festival would last around 3 days and kicked off over 50 years of alliance and cooperation between the colonists at Plymouth and the Wampanoag Confederation. This alliance would unfortunately eventually collapse when Metacomet, otherwise known as Metacom or King Philip, became the Sachem of the Wampanoag, and would eventually, and not only would the relations devolve, but even this would devolve even further into what is known today as King Philip's War from 1675 to 1676. And not so fun fact, King Philip's War, if we want to talk about percentage of the population, is the bloodiest war in American history, although technically the United States of America did not exist yet. I think something like 32% of the population ended up dying, which is just absurd for a conflict. But nevertheless, and of course, it was immensely devastating on the Native Americans as well. Probably not their most devastating war with English colonists, considering the fact that the Beaver Wars were also just utterly vicious. But yeah, one of the most violent wars in terms of percentage of population on the North American continent. In fact, I think, if I remember correctly, it is the most violent on the North American continent. And I think that actually does include the Beaver Wars if we're talking about total population, but I'm not sure about that. Nevertheless. So that's the story of the first Thanksgiving. And all of the firsthand sources indicate that it is a true story. A lot of people have recently started to say, no, the natives weren't actually invited. No, it didn't actually take place. All of these different kinds of things. They basically want to just crap all over our holidays. But all of the early sources indicate, including sources from Wampanoag descendants, indicate that this is true. This is actually what took place. Squanto came in and helped the colonists survive. Massasoit wanted to establish an alliance with them and against the Narragansett, and the colonists originally wanting to have set up a holiday just for themselves to celebrate the harvest, eventually invited the Native Americans, who would outnumber them almost 2-1, into the camp, and they would all together have a 3-day-long feast, which was not technically, like I said, a day of Thanksgiving, but a harvest festival, but nevertheless. Very cool story, in my opinion. I think it would be awesome if somebody made a movie about that. We don't have very many Thanksgiving movies, but a movie about the Plymouth Thanksgiving would, I think, be very cool. And by the way, I'd like to take this moment to say it would be nice if, and don't get me wrong, I'm not about to get on my soapbox and start bleeding heart liberaling you. I know liberaling isn't a word, but bear with me. But nevertheless, it would be nice if, in commemoration of this event, we tried to, I don't know, kind of bury the hatchet with our Native American brethren in Adam, many of whom are our brethren in Christ. I know there's a lot of bad feelings, the Native direction towards Americans, and I also know especially conservative Americans tend to be very dismissive of, the plight of a lot of our Native American brethren. But, I think it'd be a very cool thing if every time this Thanksgiving holiday came around, rather than letting the liberals and the wokies control the narrative by saying, oh, look at what happened to the natives after, look at the genocide, all that other kind of stuff, we actually were proactively saying, hey, in the spirit of this holiday, in the spirit of our ancestors coming together and serving the Lord with each other, and feasting with each other and making alliance with each other, let's do all that. Let's feast with each other, make peace with each other, love each other, all that kind of stuff. I know I'm probably sounding like a hippie right now, but I think it would be a very cool thing. Anyways, also I want to see a movie about the first Thanksgiving that wasn't actually the first or Thanksgiving, but not the point. Let's move on to the next slide. So these are some of the, in fact, these are the only two firsthand sources from or describing rather the so-called first Thanksgiving. The earlier of the two is Edward Winslow's Mort's Relation, which dates to around 1622 AD. Here's the quote. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, and it's hard to read the old style of English writing because they just write so much differently than us, right? So let me try again. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labor. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help besides, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which we brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. End quote. The next one comes from William Bradford on his Of Plymouth Plantation, which was written around 1650 AD. So much later, but nevertheless, he was actually writing this over multiple decades, but it was published around 1650. Nevertheless, the quote reads, they began now to gather in the small harvest they had, and to fill up their houses and dwellings against winter, being all well recovered in health and strength, and had all things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took good store, of which every family had their portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl, as winter approached, of which the place did abound when they can be used, but afterward decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl, there was a great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck of meal a week to a person, or now since harvest, Indian corn to the proportion, which made many afterwards write so largely of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned but true reports, end quote. And again, I do apologize if my reading there is a little bit clunky. I do personally struggle with reading early modern English. Just the way they write is foreign to me. So I do apologize if that was a little bit clunky there. Nevertheless, those are our two firsthand sources, one from Edward Winslow and one from William Bradford. We do have other sources that are very close to the event, such as sources from some Wampanoag descendants. In fact, King Philip even has some quotations that pertain to the first Thanksgiving, but none of them are actually firsthand eyewitnesses. So those are our two firsthand sources. And how cool is it that we have firsthand sources, right? I mean, it's very rare that you have firsthand sources for the first celebration of a given event, right? I mean, it's just very cool. Anyways, popular Thanksgiving traditions include, but are not limited to, church services, feasting, festive foods including turkey, squash, mashed potatoes with gravy, pumpkin pie, stuffing, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, corn, sweet corn, and etc. The watching and playing of Thanksgiving football, the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, as well as various other Thanksgiving Day parades in other cities, family gatherings, the giving of thanks and talking about what one is thankful for, prayer, giving to the poor, kicking off the holiday/Christmas season, although some would argue that Halloween is really the kickoff of the American holiday season. Black Friday comes the day after Thanksgiving. That is the largest retail shopping day in the world. And one of our funner traditions on Thanksgiving is turkey pardons. For those who are not familiar, that is when the President of the United States pardons a turkey, which is, of course, interesting because the turkey didn't commit a crime. But what is actually being done is basically we're taking this turkey and sparing its life, saying it will not be cooked up for Thanksgiving dinner this year, which is pretty cool, I think. Obviously, we have to eat, and meat is a vital part of the human diet. But it's also kind of a cruel thing, and not cruel in the sense that we're being evil, but it's just one of the cruelties of life that was not a part of God's Edenic creation and which will not be a part of God's second earth, right? And so it is kind of cool for us to, recognize the cruelty of life and spare a turkey a year from those cruelties, even though, of course, again, we all recognize that we have to eat meat. It's a vital part of our diet. And it's a very healthy part of our diet as well, right? Especially turkey meat, for the record. Turkey is a very healthy meat. But nevertheless, I think it's cool. I'm somewhat of a bleeding heart when it comes to animals, but, whatever, right? Thanksgiving turkey and other festive foods. First off, can we just take the time to point out how awesome this turkey with its pilgrim hat is? This is like one of my favorite pictures of all time. I know it's just a stupid cartoon clip art thing, but I cracked up when I saw this picture. I had to add it into here. Anyways, the main event of Thanksgiving is the Thanksgiving dinner, an extravagant feast shared with family and friends, said to be the largest eating event in America when measured by food intake as well as retail sales of food. See Nielsen for a source there. Traditionally, the meal consists of a large roasted turkey filled with stuffing, mashed potatoes and gravy, buttered rolls. Let me quickly point out, the turkey is only filled with stuffing. It is not filled with the rest of the ingredients, but at any rate, the meal also includes mashed potatoes and gravy, buttered rolls, cranberry sauce, corn, steamed squash, green beans, and a very interesting but nevertheless incredibly common element of this meal is marshmallow casserole, which is like a marshmallow sweet potato desserty dish thing. It's actually surprisingly good. But anyways, of course, amongst other things, with pumpkin, pecan, and sweet potato pies being common for dessert. The main ingredients of all these dishes are all native to North America. And by the way, some of them may have been eaten even as far back as the 1621 feast. You may ask which of these are native to North America. Well, the main ingredients of pretty much every dish I just mentioned. Potatoes are native to North America. Turkey is native to North America. Obviously, you can get bread from numerous different things, but cranberries, corn, squash, green beans, all of these are native to North America. And sweet potatoes, pumpkins, and pecans are also native to North America, which is actually why all of these are traditional to eat on Thanksgiving Day. Amongst other reasons, of course, it's not the sole reason, but one of the big reasons is, Thanksgiving is not just a day of Thanksgiving, it's also our harvest festival. And obviously, you eat the things that would be harvested here in North America, right? So pretty straightforward there. But anyways, for example, turkey is mentioned in William Bradford's On Plymouth Plantation as being a food in abundance, around autumn 1621. And Edward Winslow mentions that the men went fowling on the first day of the feast. We've already read these, but I'll read them again. Quote, and besides waterfowl, there was a great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, and etc. End quote. William Bradford on Plymouth Plantation, circa 1650. Also, Edward Winslow, quote, our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as with a little help besides, served the company almost a week, at which time amongst other recreations we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, and for 3 days we entertained and feasted. Or whom rather for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others, end quote. Why do we read those 2 quotes again? Well, just to say that turkey was actually probably on the menu in the very first Thanksgiving. Very first that we traditionally attribute to being very first. Anyway, you know what I'm saying. Anyways, corn and squash were likely also present at this first feast, and at least one source I found suggests that pumpkin pie was present as early as the 1623 feast at Plymouth, which was actually the first day of Thanksgiving declared at Plymouth, because again, weirdly enough, the first Thanksgiving was not actually a day of Thanksgiving when one considers the fact that we have these traditional Protestant days of Thanksgiving. And again, our modern Thanksgiving is a combination of a harvest festival and a Protestant day of Thanksgiving. I know I keep repeating myself with that, but it's a weird, bizarre fact that tends to get lost in translation. Thanksgiving football. Speaking of favorite images, I also love this one right here of the turkey playing football. It's just, I don't know. I'm too easily entertained, I guess, but that is so awesome. Anyways, Thanksgiving football has been a staple of the holiday almost as long as the sport has existed. The first football game recorded as taking place on Thanksgiving happened less than a month after the first football game that ever was. The first football game occurring on November the 6th, 1689, which saw Rutgers defeat Princeton, the 2 universities, 6-4. If you're wondering why it was 6-4 rather than some divisible of 7, the rules were a lot more similar to rugby back then than they are today. Nevertheless, here's a quote from the Evening Telegraph, 5th edition, published November 17th, 1869. Quote, football, a football match between 22 players of the Young America Cricket Club and the Germantown Cricket Club will take place on Thanksgiving Day, December 1st at 2 o'clock on the grounds of the Germantown Club, end quote. And again, this was to take place on December the 1st, less than a month after November the 6th of the same year, which is when the very first football game ever was played. So Thanksgiving football is less than a month younger than football period, which I just think is really cool. Only 7 years later, the first college football game to take place on Thanksgiving would occur on November 30th, 1876, being between Princeton and Yale, winning the game 2-0. They'd continue to play each other on Thanksgiving almost every year until 1893. By the way, fun fact for you guys, you may notice that Princeton is involved in both of these games, and Yale was involved in the second of these games. Football is kind of an Ivy League invention. For a long time, it was only played amongst the Ivy Leagues, amongst the Ivy League teams, with a few exceptions, those exceptions being Carlisle Indian School, Rutgers, the service academies of West Point and Annapolis. But nevertheless, for the most part, those old school Ivy League schools kind of invented football, which is very interesting to consider because those of us who watch college football know that they are kind of afterthoughts today. Everybody's talking about, Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia, etc. Nobody really talks about the Princeton Tigers anymore, but they were an incredibly crucial part of the sport's invention. Anyways, the first and longest running college football rivalry, college football classic amongst HBCUs is the Turkey Day Classic, which has been played since 1924 between Alabama State and Tuskegee. Kind of. Since 2012, Tuskegee has no longer been an annual participant, though Alabama State still is. And Tuskegee did play again in the 2021 game. Michigan University and Chicago University also played annual Thanksgiving games in the 1890s, and some have spuriously called this the beginning of Thanksgiving football, although, as we've already discussed, they were a good 20 years after the very first game, and even a good 15 years after the first college game, but nevertheless. NFL football on Thanksgiving dates back to 1922, and other leagues had played professional games as far back as 1905. From 1922 to 1933, the Chicago Bears and Chicago Cardinals played an annual Thanksgiving game, although not always against each other. Since 1934, the Detroit Lions have hosted a Thanksgiving game every year, although there have been 6 years during that stretch where they have not actually played. And since 1966, the Dallas Cowboys have done the same, although they have missed 2 years during that time. Since 2006, a third game of alternating teams has been played in the evening slot, typically on NFL Network. And so now you'll get 3 Thanksgiving football games. And that's the way it's been since 2006, with, of course, Detroit hosting one, Dallas hosting one, and then the next one just being in sort of alternating game. Here's a very interesting fun fact for you. Thanksgiving football is widely credited with spreading the popularity of Thanksgiving in the South. As Lincoln is the one who annualized the holiday in 1863, many Southerners resisted the holiday, seeing it as a Yankee festival that was forced on them, and not just forced on them by the North, but forced on them by a conquering army. Remember, 1863 is smack dab in the middle of the American Civil War, which, if you were a Southerner at the time, was not a civil war, but a revolution, right? Because you're trying to split off from the main country. And so even though the holiday dates well back to the Plymouth colony, and even though Jamestown, which is a southern area, celebrated a lot of those, or southern, a city in a southern state, Virginia, right? Celebrated a lot of their own Thanksgivings. George Washington had days of Thanksgiving established. He's a Virginian, right? Despite those things, a lot of Southerners perceived Thanksgiving as this tradition that was forced on them by a conquering army, right? It was Lincoln's festival. It was the Republicans' festival. It was the Northerners' festival, the Yankee festival, whatever you want to call it, right? But as football became more popular and synonymous with the holiday, Southerners started to warm up to the holiday. And today it is arguably more widely celebrated in the South than in the North. And the interesting thing about that is football has become such an important part of Southern culture, as has Thanksgiving itself, right? It's really cool to see, in my opinion, to see how that ended up evolving from, we don't want that, that's a Northern festival that has nothing to do with us, to we're not only going to claim Thanksgiving as our own, but also football is much more popular in the South than it is everywhere else. In fact, there are as many football teams in the South as there are in most of the rest of the NFL combined, right? You just think that you got 2 Texas teams. You used to have 2 Missouri teams back when the Rams were in Missouri. There's a Tennessee team. There's a Georgia team. There's a Carolina team. I believe there's one I'm missing. Obviously, New Orleans. Am I missing another one other than the Florida ones? There's 3 Florida teams. I mean, that's 11. 11 of the NFL teams. I guess it'd be 10 now because the St. Louis Rams are no longer in Missouri. And then even some of the other ones are very close to the South, right? Like the Washington Redskins, or the Washington Commanders now, but that's just, I don't like that name. If they're going to change it, fine, but at least change it to something that doesn't suck. Anyways, Washington's on the border of Virginia. Cincinnati's on the border of Kentucky. Indianapolis is near the border of Kentucky. Baltimore is not quite the South. It's a little, at that point, you're starting to get pretty clear into the North, but nevertheless, it does have a history with the South, right? So football has become a very important thing in the South, is the point. And Thanksgiving football is largely credited by many historians with making Thanksgiving more acceptable to the Southern populations. By the way, first off, Shalom Iron Matt, thank you for being here. And second off, exactly right, the Tennessee team, Tennessee Titans, is actually formerly a Texas team, the Houston Oilers. So a little fun football fact for you. Anyways, I thought that was very interesting. Moving on. The Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Since 1924, America's oldest and largest department retail store, Macy's, has held an annual Thanksgiving Day Parade in New York City, more specifically in Manhattan. It is tied with America's Thanksgiving Day Parade in Detroit for the second oldest parade in the holiday's history. Thanksgiving Day parades have been held annually in many cities since at least 1920. The one being held in 1920 is the oldest Thanksgiving Day parade, specifically Philadelphia's Thanksgiving Day Parade, which is currently sponsored by Dunkin' Donuts. Not sponsored, but nonetheless they are. But I see Kelly says Baltimore is technically South. It is, and its history is deeply connected with the South. In fact, Maryland almost seceded and joined the Confederacy. Fun fact, but that's not the point of this video. Anyways, despite all that, the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade is easily the most well-known, and watching it has become something of a Thanksgiving tradition in its own right, having been televised on NBC since 1953 and televised by CBS from 1948 to 1952. So it's been televised since 1948. The parade lasts around 3 hours, starting at 9 a.m. Eastern Time and lasting to 12 p.m. It's attended to by Macy's employees and their friends and families, all of whom are volunteer workers, so they volunteer to be a part of the parade. Excuse me. It includes various floats and more famously balloons, a staple of the parade since 1928 when they replaced, get this, live zoo animals. I don't know about you guys, but I think I would prefer live zoo animals, though I'm sure the workers probably prefer balloons and floats to live zoo animals. That's probably pretty dangerous. But at any rate, famous balloons include, but are not limited to, the Mickey Mouse balloon, the Donald Duck balloon, the turkey, the Felix the Cat balloon, the dragon balloon, which is the longest balloon in the parade, and actually the 1932 dragon being the longest ever, the Santa Claus balloon, the Stewie Griffin balloon, and etc. Floats and balloons can and do vary yearly, with new additions and subtractions every year. At the end of the parade, Santa Claus arrives and is greeted to initiate the Christmas season. He will typically take his spot on a throne to be crowned King of the Kitties, which is a kind of interesting tradition. And that's just said to inaugurate the Christmas season, which, interesting, but nevertheless, I'm sure a lot of people might find that to be somewhat bizarre. I was going to talk to you guys about the route that the Thanksgiving Day Parade takes. The thing is it's changed a couple times over the last decade, so I'm not 100% sure what it is. I know what it was from 1922 all the way up until, or 1924, all the way up until 2012, starting in Harlem and going through with its usual route. But it changed in 2000. Actually, I said 2012. It changed in 2009, and then again in 2012, and then I believe again in 2019. For example, it used to go through Broadway. It no longer does. It used to start in Harlem. It no longer does. I believe it used to go through Central Park, and it no longer does. So, I was going to go through explaining all that stuff, but I just figured because of the changes, I might be giving inaccurate information if I did, and just why bother, right? That's the last slide other than the conclusion slide. But before we end, I did want to go ahead and read a couple of Bible verses that pertain to the concept of Thanksgiving, because I think that would be relevant. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. This is just what does the Bible say about Thanksgiving on openbible.info. And we won't read every verse that's here because there's about 20, 25 of them. But nevertheless, just a couple of these for us all to be mindful of. 1 Thessalonians 5:18, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Psalm 107 verse 1 says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." Philippians 4:6 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." Fun fact, that word Thanksgiving is Eucharistos. That is where we get the word Eucharist. Psalm 100, verses 1 through 5 says, "A psalm for giving thanks. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing. Know that the Lord, he is God. It is he who has made us, and we are his. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him, bless his name. For the Lord is good, his steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations. I'll read a couple more. Psalm 17, verse 7, or 7, verse 17, says, I will give to the Lord the thanks due to his righteousness, and I will sing praise to the name of the Lord, the Most High. Colossians 3:15 says, and let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Psalm 50, verse 14 says, offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and perform your vows to the Most High. Colossians 4:2, this will be the one we end with, says, continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. Actually, I'll read one more because I do really like Ephesians 5:20, and that's the next one. Giving thanks always for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. So just a few verses there about what the Bible says about the concept of Thanksgiving. Of course, none of these are talking about the holiday of Thanksgiving because it just was not a thing yet. But nevertheless, I think it's cool. So we read it. Obviously, it's always important to get some scripture reading here. But nevertheless, oh, Kelby, I wonder if that's true. I've never heard that before, but that'd be very interesting if it's true. Anyways, Shalom Iron Matt, thank you for being here. Stephanie Trenton and Kevin's Biblical Discussions, shalom to you guys, and thank you for being here as well. I don't know if there's anybody I missed here. Let's see. Sherry Hatfield, Science Vids, Doki Doki, I already said shalom to you, but nevertheless, second shalom. The Weirdest Smart Channel, that's an awesome name. Shalom to you as well. Thank you for being here. Yeah, I think that's everybody. Appreciate all you guys being here. Thanksgiving is pagan. Joking, LOL. Yeah, I appreciate that, Science Vids. I'm sure somebody out there thinks that Thanksgiving is pagan. I mean, every other holiday is Thanksgiving. It's Thanksgiving. Every other holiday is pagan. Sorry. It's funny because as we've seen throughout this series, if you guys have been watching this series, none of the holidays are Thanksgiving. Literally zero of them. Christmas, oh my goodness, I said it's our Thanksgiving again. My apologies, are pagan. None of the holidays are pagan. We haven't gotten to Christmas yet, but I assure you it is not. Easter is not pagan. Candlemas is not pagan. Hanukkah, which we'll get to, not pagan. Purim, not pagan. Halloween, not pagan. Even Halloween, yes, not pagan. None of the holidays which we celebrate derive from pagan holidays. Every now and then, a tradition potentially has some origins in paganism. But even then, it's not clear, and it's also not the holiday itself. It's a tradition of the holiday, right? It's so utterly bizarre. And some of the holidays that we're not even going to get to in this series, people constantly say, oh, no, that's pagan. Like I've heard Mother's Day, Father's Day, Valentine's Day. It's all pagan. Everything. It's like everything under the sun is apparently pagan. I actually saw one time this guy who was trying to argue that Christmas was pagan, and he said, well, on Christmas, we have a big feast, and guess what they did in the pagan holidays of Saturnalia? And it's like, really? Feasting? Well, gee, I mean, if the pagans feasted, I guess Christmas must be pagan. Did they drink out of circular cups too? Because I guess circular cups must be pagan also. You know what I mean? Like, it's just the Scroogeism amongst some Christians who are my brothers in Christ. They're just wrong and annoying. It's just so baffling to me. It makes no sense. It's like the amount of research that you guys have put into this is akin to the amount of research that people put into declaring the Easter Island heads were actually created by aliens. In fact, it's literally the exact same kind of pop history research. And it's frustrating. But anyways, that was a big rant that I went on because of a joke that Science Vids told, which was a funny joke, but nevertheless. Jerry from Studies God's Word is here as well. He has a brief question here. By the way, guys, you can ask questions here. I will answer them. Obviously, if you give super chats, those have priority. But if I see your questions and they're not super chats, I will still try to answer. It says about the year of Jubilee. Is the 50th year the first year of the next cycle? Is the 50th year and the first year of the next cycle the same year? I've seen where it seems to be represented that way a couple of times lately. I'm sure what you've seen is you have probably seen it. But no, the 50th year is supposed to be a year unto itself. And then you count 1 to 49, and then the next 50th year being the next in the Jubilee cycle. So, yeah, it's not supposed to be part of that cycle. The first year would be the year after the Jubilee cycle. And then you go through your 49 typical years, and of course, that 50th year being the Jubilee itself. Excellent question, though, because I'm more than confident that that has been described wrongly by more than a few people. So yeah, excellent question. And by the way, rebuke and reprove. Shalom, Jill, and thank you for being here. We're almost done. I only have one last slide here. So let me go ahead, and it's really nothing special. It's just the conclusion slide. So let me go ahead and do that. And then we'll go ahead and do some channel housekeeping and get out of here. Shalom, Jamie, and thank you for being here. More on here. That's funny. Yeah, we won't get into all that, but I know what you're referencing, and suffice it to say, I'm not a part of it. Converted to Moranism. I gotta stop reading the chat. Oh my goodness. Anyways, conclusions. Here's our conclusions. On this day, not April the 3rd, but Thanksgiving, we celebrate the prosperity God has blessed us with and give him thanks. We give him thanks for our family, our friends, and our nation, and we seek to make peace with the enemies of our past whom we once lived in harmony with. We also take the time to remember our heritage, our history, and the path which got us here. So Chag Sameach, my friends, and may you live long and prosper, which, fun fact, derives from an old Jewish saying. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you did, please remember to like and share this video and consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. And remember, we have 2 Chag Sameachs coming up very shortly on Hanukkah and on Christmas. Want to remind you guys that we do weekly Sabbath night open mics every Friday night. Although we may not actually have one this week. I'm not 100% sure yet. Also want to remind you guys that I am going to be publishing a book here soon, 18 Questions for the Reformed Answered. If you are interested in Reformed theology, or you are against Reformed theology and want to know what a Calvinist has to say about some of the most common objections, or if you're a Calvinist and want to either have answers to some of the most common objections or want to pass them out to your friends, or if you just want to read the book, you don't really need a reason that I'm listing here, right? Please be on the lookout for that. I hope to have it published either by late April or early May. And, of course, that would be a huge, huge step in the quest to being an apologist. Appreciate everybody who's helped get me here. Also, remember, you can follow us on various social media platforms. I am on Gab, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, and Minds. Also, if anybody here wants to contribute to us financially, you can do so either through super chats and super stickers, or by subscribing to the Patreon for a week or a monthly donation of as much or as little as you like, or by giving a one-time donation to the PayPal if you seek to do so. And I certainly appreciate anybody who is willing to do that as well. Obviously, turning this into a full-time career will require people being generous to me with their money. And if you guys feel that I am deserving of that and are deciding to actually vote in that direction by way of your dollar, I certainly do appreciate that. Though I appreciate everybody watching and subscribing and all that other kind of stuff as well. Remember, if you're not watching this live, questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, and critiques in the comment section down below. And with that, friends, our next episode will be a Chag Sameach on Hanukkah. If the Lord wills and tarries, we will see you soon. Shalom and God bless you.